Hi, it's a beautiful sunny day here in Berlin. Hope the weather's good where you are. I'm going to be running through the presentation I did at Power to the Teacher conference in May of this year, May 2016 in Barcelona. The purpose of this presentation is just to open up debate on what I think are things that we ignore, things that are ignored in ELT and things that we don't question. And I first came to Barcelona in 2011 to finish my TESOL diploma. And when I arrived, I saw this. At the main square in Barcelona was just full of bodies, full of protesters, because this was right in the middle of the Indignados or 15M protest. And there was such a spirit of hope and optimism and excitement in the air. And it was really exciting to be there. But unfortunately, on the second day I was in Barcelona, the protests finished. And I've been on many protests over the years. This is always sad. This whole optimism fades and dissipates. This energy just disappears into the air. But as I was walking around Barcelona, my little area where I was staying, the protest hadn't finished. There were still people gathered, talking, still had that same spirit of hope and optimism. And I realized then that this wasn't the end of a protest, but the beginning of something else. Because out of that protest came Podemos. And Podemos, the political party, are now in government. So this movement of grassroots activism went from protest to policy, from protest to power. And a few words what brought me to this title, of the slightly ridiculous title of shooting sacred mice in ELT. One thing is that one criticism of the teacher group that I set up with help from Nicola Prentice, both of us co-founders. One criticism is that we're just a bunch of memes, just a bunch of stupid memes that we flood the internet with. So let's take a look at a few of these memes. There tends to be a reaction that because we want to talk about working conditions, there's some sort of barbarians at the gates. We're breaking some ancient taboo. So some of the memes are polemic. Some of them are ironic. Anyone who works in Germany will know this situation, teaching business English and having no money. Some of them poke fun at the industry. I'm sure we've all been told to reduce our photocopies at some stage or other. But some are serious. As we've said, what we believe is that change isn't going to come until grassroots teachers bring it, and that's what we're aiming to do, to move from protest to policy, to really change things for the benefit of all teachers. And memes in general have been dismissed and ignored by most academics, unworthy of academic study, until very recently. Julie Burgess, in her paper, talks about memes as vernacular creativity. And memes speak the language of ordinary people. This is the vernacular. Vernacular is the ordinary language of ordinary people. And vernacular has always faced criticism from elites. And for me, how I first got involved with the vernacular was that I sensed that there was a gap between the elites in ELT and ordinary grassroots teachers, and this is personified in demand high teaching. Now don't get me wrong, I've got Adrian's and Jim's books on my shelves, but when they asked teachers, where is the learning, it was almost as if we were responsible with our crazy implementation of these wacky communicative ideas, that we were responsible for losing the learning. Almost as if there was a lost cat and we lost the learning, and we needed some experts and we needed some help in getting the learning back. And this wasn't a nice feeling. So this is the vernacular. And this kind of sense of the vernacular led me to edit with my wife, Teresa Gorman, teacher stories because we wanted a place where teachers can tell their own stories, they can talk in their own language. So this is the vernacular, and I have a thesis for this presentation. The thesis is, by ignoring the social, philosophical and historical foundations of our practice, we impoverish our pedagogy. I want to bring back in these ideas of the social, the historical, philosophical, and of course bring back in pedagogy, which is often missing, I find. And where do I get this wacky idea of bringing these things in? Well, in teacher education in Finland, one of the top countries in OECD ratings, this forms the basis of their master's level program. So it's not an unusual and crazy idea. Okay, so let's return to sacred mice. Okay, it's actually very hard to find a picture of a sacred mice. When I put this presentation together and sent off the proposal, it took me quite a few days to find a sacred mice, and I had to go to badlystuffedanimals.com. 23,000 likes. If you're interested in the wacky world of bad taxidermy, take a look. So the first sacred mouse is the market and market values in general. Sandel, in his book What Money Can't Buy, writes that we drifted from having a market economy to being a market society. And he gives the example of a school in Israel. And in this school, parents often come late to pick up their kids. And this leads to problems because the teachers also have to stay late to take care of the kids, and this problem gets kind of worse and worse and worse. So what the school does is they implement a fine for any parent who comes late to pick up their children. And they think this is a good kind of market solution to the problem. Now, what do you think happened when they introduced this fine? Well, simply, the problem got much, much worse. The parents treated the fine as a fee. Now, instead of parents with a duty to pick up their children, they were consumers. And they treated the fine as a payment to for teachers to stay longer and look after the kids. The system allowed them to pay teachers for working longer without feeling guilty about the inconvenience caused. So the school had to scrap the scheme at the end. Because by paying people to make moral choices, by paying people as consumers to try and nudge them towards what you want, you end up devaluing morality itself. But how did we move? What was the system before the current system of a market society? Well, this was a Keynesian social democratic society, roughly the post-war kind of agreement. And under this kind of system, the market serves society. There's a commitment to full employment. Please excuse the spelling mistake. Capital and labour come to a compromise. This is the time of unionization. Strong unions agreeing with capital, having some kind of agreement over production, basically. Wages are linked to productivity. If productivity rises, this gets passed on to the worker. And in Keynesian economic theory, the state has a role in influencing demand. For example, if GDP drops, the government will to implement some new scheme, will create jobs in order to influence the economy. And although it is not there are arguments about this, it is a relatively stable system. It's a relatively stable system, and if you're like me, you speak to your parents, then they probably had the same job for a long time. My dad had the same job for most of his adult life, which is no longer true for young people these days, and it's no longer true for me. And we moved from this system to a neoliberal system, where society is in effect marketized. There are now market solutions to social problems, as I mentioned previously. There's a commitment to flexibility. You no longer have jobs for life. instead of capital and labour coming to a compromise, the capital and the state compromises. If I'm a big corporation like Google, I can sit down with the government and I can effectively negotiate how much tax I'm going to pay, because big corporations have a lot of power and influence. Wages are no longer linked to productivity. There's been massive productivity gains over the last 30 years, but these haven't been passed on to workers. And the state's role changes. The state no longer influences demand, but it really enables markets through legislation and frameworks. You can see this in the privatization of the railway networks, the current debates over privatization of the healthcare system in the UK. So the role of the state has changed. And if you like this system, it's very dynamic. If you're on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak, it can be very unstable. So thank God for neoliberalism, say some people, particularly the rich and those at the top of the corporations, those at the top of the banks. This is a great system. It's a fantastic system. But for other people, it's a bit like walking a tightrope. Everything's fine. It's very exciting at first, very dynamic. But if you ever look down, you kind of see that the social safety nets that were there previously for your parents' generation, they're slowly either being dismantled or stripped away. Health, pension, union rights, these are the kind of things that are being taken away. And what kind of impact does this have on our everyday lives? Well, for one thing, it changes the way we speak about things. The late sociologist Doreen Massey, in a really good essay, short essay, Vocabularies of the Economy, says that, in effect, we have become customers. We're not passengers on trains, readers in libraries, patients in hospitals, students in universities. We're all customers now. Coming back to English language teaching, there is a lot of criticism of this kind of market model, and there's growing criticism, particularly in our world of the CELTA. I mean, the CELTA, you pay your money and you get marks. It's a market-driven qualification, not profession-driven. I mean, although the course itself is good, whether it should be the gateway qualification is open to question. I mean, people pay money for the CELTA, they expect to pass. They are, in effect, customers, consumers, and the CELTA is a commodity. Okay, that's the first sacred mouse. Are you all still with me out there? Getting tired? Okay, second sacred mouse. Empowerment. In a recent New York Times article, Gia Torrentino kind of explores the history of the concept of empowerment and says that it's been transformed into something for women to buy. And it's a very good article because it maps the kind of history of the concept. And it starts with Paulo in Brazil, with his notion of critical consciousness. I was going to write the Spanish translation, but I can never say it. Conscientization. It's very difficult to say. But Paulo Freire's idea of critical consciousness means that groups, and it has to be groups, identify the structural basis of oppression, and these groups, they take action. This comes from his experience in his native Brazil, where he taught literacy to poor people, and he was imprisoned for a short time by the dictatorship there. I mean, Paulo Freire's work was written in a spirit of protest against injustice. But as this concept of empowerment moved from protest to policy, it changed, and I would argue it got diluted. So by the 1970s, it just becomes a way of reducing powerlessness, which is a whole different concept. This is Barbara Bryant Solomon, who was a social worker working with black communities in the States, the United States. And here it's just reducing powerlessness, because you lack power because you're the member of a stigmatized group. You're an individual member of a stigmatized group. And this is a different concept from Freire's idea. And empowerment, really, when it goes into policy, becomes a buzzword, and it has very little sense of the original meaning. It's kind of taken for granted, not questioned anymore. The definition of empowerment really broadens out in the 80s. Julian Rappaport even created what he calls empowerment theory. And here we all have empowerment as a potential, and it's a control over one's own life, your own individual life. It's no longer a group process. And from here it's a step to Sheryl Sandberg, CEO of Facebook, and her philosophy of lean in. Her belief is that just by sheer willpower, hard work, you can smash through the glass ceiling. Of course, this whole kind of belief ignores the fact that some people have more resources to start with. I mean, even through willpower and hard work, some people won't succeed. If you're white, middle class, you obviously stand a much better chance of success. I mean, if you're black, working class, or a non-native speaker in our profession, your chances of success are smaller. Lean in is a fairy tale. So in roughly 40 years, we've gone from Paulo Freire to Facebook, and that's quite a journey. Let's say goodbye to empowerment then. Are you still there? A little tired? Grab a coffee. This is the most difficult part of my presentation, and it's the one that gave me the most trouble. It really had a concept I really had to wrestle with, because the final sacred mouse is reflective practice. So this is the one you really need that strong cup of coffee for, because this is the most difficult part. I apologize. So when I went in 2011 to Barcelona to do my diploma, I've already mentioned, these kind of doubts about reflective practice were already surfacing. Because of its woolliness, I just found the whole thing kind of woolly and vague. Reflection in action, reflection on action, the basis for reflective practice, which is Donald Schon's critique of technical rationality. I wasn't sure if that really held water. I mean, it was vague and confusing then, and it's still vague and confusing now. And the diploma syllabus, the TESOL diploma syllabus, is saturated with this kind of reflective practitioner, action research. It's throughout the whole syllabus, because what they claim is that reflective practice represents a more bottom-up way of looking at teacher education and ELT teacher education, and I'm not sure if this is true. And I wrote about my doubts in a blog post called Narcissus and the Reflective Practitioner, where I kind of questioned these were my first doubts about reflective teaching. Because if you haven't got much experience in teaching, my point was that you're just basically looking at a reflection of yourself in the mirror, and I'm not sure on what basis you can really improve if you're just looking at a reflection of yourself. And how do you know, if you do some action research, if you conduct action research, how do you know your conclusions are valid in any way, in any shape or form? And remember my thesis: by ignoring the social, philosophical and historical origins of our practice, we impoverish our pedagogy, and I'm trying to bring pedagogy back in. So to critique reflective practice, you really need to turn to philosophy, and in particular American pragmatist philosophy. Okay, John Dewey is a very famous American writer, educationalist. William James, a very famous pragmatist philosopher, and Donald Schon, is the real guy who popularized reflective practice with his 1983 book, The Reflective Practitioner. And the interesting thing about pragmatism, pragmatist philosophers, and these are all pragmatists, they share a concern with action. With pragma means action in Greek. They are not interested in causes, they're interested in outcomes and results. And pragmatist philosophers don't believe that you can have foundational criteria on which to verify your claims. Your claims are in fact verified by their outcomes or results. And you'll see this now. William James wrote that truth happens to an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events. Which is kind of a revolutionary idea at the time. I think this was written at the end of the 19th century, maybe beginning of the 20th. And I'm sure you can see the problem here. If you have no criteria on which to verify your claims, then taking action and changing things becomes difficult. For example, how do you justify the decision to go to war? You need some kind of moral framework or criteria to make that decision. And pragmatist philosophy has been called the philosophy of the status quo because it cannot account for why you would want to change things. And so this philosophy is perfect for two groups of people, I would argue. The first is politicians. How perfect! I apply truth to an idea. I start with the desired result and work backwards. Fantastic! Remember those weapons of mass destruction? There were no weapons of mass destruction. It was a fantasy. They applied truth to an idea. And this is dangerous. The other group of people, this is very good, are PR people as well. Public relations. Okay, so that's pragmatist philosophy. And at a conference about power to the teacher, the leading theorist of power is Michel Foucault, the French philosopher. So let's talk about his theories and his idea of governmentality. So I've spoken about pragmatist philosophy, applying truth to an idea, and I'm going to talk about Foucault and his idea of a governmentality, which it's the idea that we no longer need a state or a leader or a dictator to tell us what to do. In modern societies, in a neoliberal kind of world, we govern ourselves. He calls it the bumblebee who rules the beehive without needing a sting. One example might be these kind of, I don't know if you've seen these little Fitbits. A Fitbit is like a device you wear on your wrist, and it tells you how many steps you've walked. It tells you it has targets and goals that you can set, and you're kind of self-governing in that. You're kind of self-governing your health. You don't need a doctor to dictate to you what you do. You're kind of self-governing. You're monitoring your own health and your health regime. And this is kind of, I think, what Foucault is getting at. Andreas Fayers, in a 2008 study, points out that reflection itself is not neutral or apolitical, but a governing practice that acts to produce a desired subjectivity. And with reflective practice, what is the mechanism that produces this desirable subjectivity? I mean, when I did my diploma, how did I become a reflective practitioner? What is the mechanism? This is a good question, a difficult question to answer. And the answer he gives is that through the logbooks, through the essays, through the assignments, reflective practice in all of its spheres, in nursing, in teaching, the mechanism is confession. We don't need a leader to tell us what to do anymore. We do it ourselves, we confess. And this you often hear the question with reflective practice, what could I have done better? And anyone with a religious upbringing, this is kind of a sort of a religious idea. What could I have done better? You're kind of confessing your sins and becoming a reflective practitioner, a better practitioner. So that's where we've come to, that's where I've come to. It's a reflective practice. I went through pragmatist philosophy, applying truth to an idea, through Foucault's idea of governmentality, and the mechanism by which we become reflective practitioners is confession. And this is a little controversial, and this caused quite a few remarks at the conference. The kind of person that is perhaps produced through this process is, in some ways, uncritical, competitive, and unconcerned with matters outside of the teaching self. This is within our profession. There is a tendency to stay quiet, to not criticize things, to be competitive, and to kind of have a very narrow focus. Yeah? Returning back to my thesis, we're not so concerned with the social, historical, and the philosophical. These concerns are outside our kind of ken, our kind of area that we think about. And I think that's why there's been such a kind of dramatic reaction to teachers as workers, because we challenge this. We challenge this kind of subjectivity that's created. And perhaps the ideal subjectivity that's created through this is the edupreneur, the teacherpreneur. This perhaps is the ultimate perfect subjectivity that maybe is uncritical, competitive, and only concerned with a tiny fraction of pedagogy in the teaching world. So, again, this subjectivity is great for business. Thank God for neoliberalism. Okay, I hope you're still there. I hope you're not too tired. And if you have any questions, then please send them in to me. I'm really interested to hear people's reactions to this presentation and about the ideas I've gone over here. And to conclude, the 3 sacred mice I've spoken about, in my opinion, are nothing more than stuffed, dead animals. And we should really move beyond this. But we can only move beyond this by reconsidering the social, the philosophical, and historical origins of our practice. And I've critiqued these sacred mice. Well, so what? Do I have any solutions? A roadmap? Well, I suggest that we ask ourselves 4 questions. With teachers as workers, we often speak about low wages, lack of rights, lack of pension, no union recognition, and the 4 questions kind of address this. So where is the profession going? Are we heading to further kind of low wages, precarious employment? Is this development desirable? And the 2 important questions, are who gains and who loses in this system, in this development, this road we're heading down, and by which power mechanisms? And the last question, what do we do? So this is an open conversation for everyone in ELT, in a whole teaching profession. What should we do about it? And I think that thinking about these questions and coming up with a solution together as a community and giving real teachers, giving grassroots teachers a say in the future of our profession, that would be real power to the teacher. Okay, thanks very much for listening. Look forward to your comments.